When we examine the poem Death is a Dialogue by Emily Dickinson, we obviously think, well, absolutely she personifies death in the poem. It's right there in the title, Death is a Dialogue. But when we take a closer look at the revisions that she made on her manuscript, we see that Dickinson's contemplation of word choice shows a clear deliberation and purposeful allotment of human-like identity to death. Here's an example of one of the most common and widely available examples of a published edition of the poem. This is courtesy of Belknap Press of Harvard University Press, edited by R.W. Franklin. Death is a dialogue between the spirit and the dust. Dissolve, says death. The spirit, sir, I have another trust. Death doubts it, argues from the ground. The spirit turns away, just laying off for evidence an overcoat of clay. Now, this version seems very straightforward, but Dickinson scholar Susan Howe says that when we only examine the commonly published form of Dickinson's poems, without taking into account the scrawls, turnabouts, astonishments, strokes, cuts, and masks that are found in the original manuscripts, we valorize the poem. In other words, when we neglect the revisions that Dickinson originally made on the original manuscript, or we're simply unaware of them, we impose our own meaning upon the poem. And so do the editors and publishers. We can see one example of this valorization of the poem in this image, courtesy of the Houghton Library, wherein Dickinson originally wrote the word argues, and then adds an asterisk that draws our eyes to the bottom of the page, annotating argues with the word reasons. What can we make of this? Perhaps Dickinson was contemplating switching out the word argues in favor of reasons, a more human-like verb, as anything can make an argument. But reasoning is only an ability that humans have. Therefore, changing the meaning of death in the poem entirely. Instead of it being this naturally occurring phenomenon that can make an argument, it instead takes on the human-like action, the ability to reason through something, to deliberate, to contemplate. And we can see the discrepancy between these two words when we examine them contextually through the lexicon provided by the Dickinson Archive. We can see that according to the lexicon, Dickinson mostly uses the verb argue when something has the ability to make something clear, to prove or assert a point. To argue, to Dickinson, is to prove, insist, contradict, or to give evidence. The word argues is mostly used in the context of presentation. When something argues, it serves as a means of presenting evidence. That process is external. However, when we examine the word reason in the Dickinson lexicon, we see that Dickinson mostly correlates this verb to something that thinks, ponders, muses, contemplates, philosophizes, thinks rationally. The process is internal, requires deliberation and metacognition. One could argue that by using the verb argues, that Dickinson already gives death the ability to dissent verbally. However, by using the verb reasons as opposed to argues, Dickinson gives death the ability to philosophize, to use logic, to contend, to think about its own process of thinking. Yes, the word argues does personify death in a way, but the usage of the verb reasons would have given death a much higher level of human-like cognition. When we examine this revision of the original manuscript, we see that Dickinson was contemplating the choice between the two different words. And we notice here in this example that publishers and editors, just like Franklin, ended up going with the word argues. So by doing this, and by taking Dickinson's revision of the manuscript into account, by making the decision between reasons and argues, and sticking with argues, are modern publishers and editors creating a new, different experience for the readers, one where death argues instead of reasons, thus leaving out the more personified version of death that Dickinson contemplated? Do we, the readers, valorize the poem through reading it the way that the publishers have decided for us? Obviously, only Dickinson knows which verb she would have preferred to appear in the final product. However, it certainly is interesting to see Dickinson's contemplation between the two verbs, and how our perception of her choice to use the verb reasons alters our entire perception of death in the poem. By leaving out the word reasons, and instead using the word argues, we may have never read the poem with Dickinson's intent to further humanize death. Being aware of the revisions Dickinson made in the original manuscript creates an entirely unique reading experience each time we find ourselves coming back to the poem.